I didn't notice the woman when I pressed the shutter. The road was empty. I was sure of it. Yet when I developed the photo that night, her figure stood there at the far edge of the frame, as if she'd been waiting for me to look. Something about her posture, the way she rested her hands at her sides, made my stomach tighten. She was familiar in the way a half-remembered dream is familiar. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a stranger passing by. Connecticut has miles of quiet back roads where anyone could appear and vanish without meaning anything. But she didn't look like someone out for a walk. She looked purposeful, still, almost expecting to be found. The longer I stared at the print, the more I felt an uncomfortable pull, a sense that I had caught something I shouldn't have. The next morning, the police knocked on my door. They didn't come in aggressively, but their eyes told me they weren't there by chance. They asked if I knew the woman in the photo. They asked when I had taken it. They asked why I hadn't reported seeing her. Only then did they tell me she'd been missing for months. And suddenly, that quiet stretch of road in the picture felt colder, like the moment I captured hadn't belonged entirely to the present. After they left, I tried to retrace my steps, driving back to the same spot with the same camera. The late autumn air hung low and heavy, carrying a kind of silence that makes every sound feel older than it should be. I stood exactly where I had been before, lifted the camera, and took just one picture. Nothing felt special in the moment. No breeze, no presence, no instinct telling me something was wrong. But when I checked the camera later, a second image I hadn't taken was waiting for me. And in it, the missing woman stared directly at me, aged by what looked like 15 years. Her eyes held something I still don't know how to explain. Fear, recognition, or maybe a warning from somewhere time wasn't supposed to reach. My name is Stephen, and in 1993, I lived alone in a small town tucked into the quieter side of Connecticut. Back then, my days were simple in a way that feels almost foreign now. Work at the hardware store, long drives on back roads, and evenings spent developing film in my dimly lit kitchen. Photography wasn't a job for me. It was the one place where I felt time slowed down enough to understand myself. The road where all of this began wasn't special. No local legends, no strange history, no reason for anyone to remember it. It was just a narrow two-lane strip running between tired maples and old stone walls, the kind of place you only drive through when you're trying to avoid the busier highway. I had stopped there countless times before, always drawn to the quiet that seemed to settle differently depending on the hour. That afternoon, the light filtered through the trees in a way I hadn't seen for weeks. Soft, pale, as if the day was hesitating to move forward. I lifted my camera almost without thinking. It was something I did often, capturing little moments no one else would notice, moments that felt like they belonged more to memory than to the present. I didn't expect anything unusual. I didn't feel watched or followed. The road was as empty as it had always been. When I clicked the shutter, I thought nothing of it. But later that night, as the image took shape in the developer tray, I felt the first hint of something I wouldn't understand for a long time. A subtle shift, a quiet wrongness, as if the photo had held on to a moment that didn't belong to me. I stared at the print for a long time, telling myself I was imagining things. And then, of course, the police came. That was the moment I realized the photo wasn't just unusual. It was impossible. And what waited for me on the second photo was something even stranger. Hi, my name is Stephen. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Have you ever captured something in a photo that felt a little out of place? Thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel. Now, let's get back to the story. I didn't sleep much after the police left that night. Their questions kept replaying in my head, overlapping with the image of her standing at the far edge of that empty road. I laid the photo on the kitchen table, the single overhead bulb making the grain of the print look almost alive. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe she'd stepped into the frame right as I pressed the shutter and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe my memory of that afternoon was worse than I thought. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my chest tightened with the feeling that time itself was arguing with me. I went through the sequence of events again and again. The drive, the stop, the silence, the way the light had fallen through the trees. I remembered checking my rear view mirror. I remembered listening to the click of the cooling engine. I remembered the breeze nudging the branches above me. But what I didn't remember was a woman. Not walking, not standing, not even the sense of another person nearby. My life had always been quiet, but that day felt almost aggressively ordinary, which made her presence in the photograph feel like a sentence someone had edited into my diary without asking. The officers had been polite, but there was a weight behind their politeness that scared me. One of them, a younger man with tired eyes, kept glancing at the photo as if it might change while he wasn't looking. The other, older and slower to speak, did most of the talking. Her name was Claire, they said. She'd been missing for 3 months. The last confirmed sighting was miles away from that road. No one could explain why she would have been there, and I had nothing to offer them except a shaken voice and a story that sounded less believable each time I repeated it. "You're sure you didn't see her?" the older officer asked, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. His tone wasn't accusing, not yet. It was probing, careful, like he was leaving room for me to correct myself before things became more official. I wanted to tell him that if I had seen her, really seen her, I wouldn't have gone home and developed the film like it was any other day. I would have called someone. I would have done something. But all I could manage was a quiet, "No, I didn't." They wrote things down. They exchanged looks. They told me they might need to keep the print for evidence, but that I could keep the negative. When they finally left, the house felt wrong in its own skin, as if their questions had rearranged the air. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ordinary sounds, anchored to an ordinary night. And yet the photograph on the table was anything but ordinary, and I had no idea what that made me. I tried to eat something but gave up after a few bites. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I ended up sitting back down with the negative, holding it up to the light like some kind of confession. Even in miniature, she was there, thin and sharp against the pale strip of road. I traced her outline with my thumb, careful not to actually touch the film. Her posture seemed even more deliberate now. Not casual, not mid-step, but almost posed, as if she had been aware of the camera in a way I hadn't been. Eventually, I gathered the rest of the photos from that day, spreading them across the table in a rough line. Trees, road, sky, an old fence post, a distant barn, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Only that one frame had changed the rules. I found myself counting the seconds I remembered standing there, trying to measure whether someone could have appeared and vanished in the gaps of my attention. 5 seconds looking at the trees, 3 seconds lowering the camera, 2 seconds adjusting my footing. How many seconds does it take for a life to walk into your story uninvited? I woke before sunrise the next morning, not because I wanted to, but because the house felt unsettled in a way I couldn't ignore. Every shadow looked like it was leaning toward me. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like a footstep stopping just short of my door. I kept thinking about Claire, about the way she stood in that photo, about how she felt both present and impossibly distant. I didn't know her, yet she had left a mark on my mind large enough to wake me before the light even touched the windows. I made coffee I didn't really drink and sat at the table again, staring at the photograph the police hadn't taken. Without the officers there, without their pens and steady questions, the image looked different. Not less strange, never that, but somehow lonelier. The road stretched out behind her like it was trying to distance itself from her presence. Her clothes weren't fancy, just a dark coat and faded jeans. But the longer I looked, the more I felt as if she didn't belong to the moment I had frozen on film. She looked slightly out of sync with the world around her, like a memory placed inside the wrong scene. By mid-morning, I couldn't sit anymore. I grabbed my jacket, the camera, and my keys. A part of me expected the police to reappear, to ask more questions, to tell me there was some new development. But the street outside was silent except for the wind pushing leaves along the pavement. I locked the door behind me, feeling as though the house itself was relieved to see me go. The drive back to the road felt longer than the day before, even though nothing had changed. Same cracked asphalt, same winding path through thinning trees, same stone walls breaking into moss. Yet everything felt different because now I knew what had been captured there. The place didn't look haunted or cursed. It looked painfully normal. And that was somehow worse. You expect strange things to happen in strange places. You don't expect them to happen in the middle of an ordinary morning. I parked in the same spot as before. The engine ticked as it cooled, echoing the memory of that first visit. I stepped out slowly, half expecting to feel watched. But the air was still, and the only sound was the quiet rustle of branches above me. I walked to the exact place where I had taken the photo. I knew it too well now. The shallow dip in the ground, the slanted tree trunk, the patch of gravel where my left foot had rested. I lifted the camera and looked through the viewfinder. The scene was identical. The fence post still leaned at the same tired angle. The shadows fell in the same direction. Even the light filtering through the leaves had the same muted quality, as if the day was trapped in a loop, repeating itself quietly. But there was no one standing at the edge of the frame this time. No hint of a figure. No interruption in the silence. I lowered the camera and exhaled, unsure whether I felt relieved or disappointed. I didn't want anything supernatural, impossible, or inexplicable to be real. But a part of me also needed confirmation, something to justify the unease that had settled into my bones. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for something to change, for a sound or movement that might explain what I'd captured. Nothing came. Eventually, I took a single photo and started to walk back toward the car. And that was when I saw it. Not a person, not a ghost, not anything living. Just a small piece of paper caught against a stone. At first, I thought it was trash, but when I stepped closer, I realized it was a fragment of a torn photograph, weathered, softened at the edges, the kind of thing that had been out there for a while, but not long enough to fully fade. I picked it up carefully, my pulse climbing. It showed nothing but trees, maybe the same trees behind me, maybe not. But the texture, the color, the grain of the film, it looked painfully similar to my own work. Someone had taken another photo here. Someone else had stood where I stood, and suddenly the empty road didn't feel empty at all. I turned the fragment of the photograph over in my hand, half expecting some kind of writing on the back, a date, a name, anything that might tell me who had left it there. But it was blank, just a thin, weathered corner torn from a larger print. The edges were uneven, as if whoever ripped it hadn't bothered to be careful. Or maybe they had been in a hurry. Either way, the idea that someone else had taken a picture on this same stretch of road unsettled me more than seeing Claire in my own frame. This wasn't chance. It wasn't a stray piece of trash. It felt placed, or dropped, or lost by someone who had been searching for something they didn't find. I kept looking around, scanning the ground for more pieces. The forest floor was scattered with leaves and old pine needles, and it was hard to tell what might be a torn scrap of paper and what was just debris. I crouched and brushed my hand through the leaves, hoping something else would reveal itself. A second fragment would have helped. It would have made this strange discovery feel less like an omen and more like a coincidence. But there was nothing. Just that one piece, small enough to slip between two fingers, and somehow heavy enough to change the air around me. I slipped the fragment into my jacket pocket and stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of why it bothered me so much. Maybe it was because it confirmed a possibility I had tried to ignore, that someone else had been here with a camera, and they hadn't wanted their photograph to be found. Or maybe, more disturbingly, their picture had captured something they didn't know how to live with. As I walked back to the car, an uncomfortable awareness settled into my thoughts. The kind of awareness you feel when you realize you're not the first person to arrive at a moment that shouldn't exist. Someone had come before me. Someone who might have seen her. Someone who might have tried to make sense of the same wrongness pressing against the edges of that quiet road. I got into the car but didn't turn the engine on right away. Instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, replaying every detail in my head. The first photo, the missing woman, the questions from the police, and now this fragment from a stranger's camera. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe someone had simply dropped a piece of an old picture months ago, but the timing felt too precise, too aligned, as though the place itself was stitching moments together in a way people weren't meant to notice. Eventually, I started the car and began the drive home. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon pulled tight, and the further I got from that spot, the more the world seemed to regain its usual rhythm. No strange quiet, no static in the air, just the normal hum of everyday life. Distant houses, old barns, scattered mailboxes leaning toward the road. But even as the scenery softened into familiarity, a tremor of unease followed me like a shadow that refused to sync with my steps. Back home, the house felt slightly warmer, as if it had been holding its breath while I was gone. I set the camera on the table and took out the film to develop the new photo. The process felt slower this time, more deliberate. Every movement felt weighted with the possibility of what I might see. As the image began to appear in the developer tray, I leaned forward, bracing myself. The road emerged first, unchanged, unremarkable, empty. Then the trees, then the dark shape of the fence post. It was the same angle, the same moment, the same silence captured in grain. Nothing stood at the far edge of the frame this time. No blurred figure, no woman, just the road. But when I lifted the photograph from the tray and held it toward the light, a chill ran through me. Because there, imprinted faintly along the bottom edge of the image, was the shape of a shoe print, as if someone else had been standing just out of frame. Someone who hadn't appeared in the photo, but had been close enough to leave a trace. And the direction of the print? It pointed toward me. I stared at the faint shoe print along the bottom edge of the photograph, holding the paper so close to the kitchen light that the heat from the bulb warmed my fingertips. The print wasn't sharp. It wasn't an obvious footprint in the mud kind of mark. It was more like a momentary disturbance, something that shouldn't have been captured, but somehow was. A softened outline, a partial heel, the curve of a tread, too intentional to be an accident, too subtle to be coincidence. It felt like whoever had stood there belonged to the moment differently than the rest of the world did. I set the photo on the table and stepped back, my mind racing. It wasn't as frightening as seeing Claire. Nothing ever would be. But it was unsettling in a different way. When I photographed the road, I hadn't seen anyone nearby. No rustling in the trees, no shifting shadows, no hint of movement, and yet the camera had recorded something I'd missed, or someone entirely outside the frame of my understanding. For a moment, I wondered if the shoe print might have belonged to Claire herself, but the angle didn't match the way she had stood in the first picture. Her stance had been still, almost formal, feet together, arms at her sides. The print in this new image was angled toward me, like someone approaching, or watching. I sank into the chair and rubbed my hands over my face, trying to steady my breathing. The house felt restless again, its familiar creaks tapping out a rhythm that made me feel less alone than I wanted to be. I tried to remind myself there had to be an explanation. Cameras catch strange things sometimes. Light can misbehave. Shadows can trick the eye. But those excuses only sounded reasonable when I said them out loud. In my head, they felt like thin blankets thrown over something vast and cold. The logical part of me, the part that had always kept my feet on the ground, told me to call the police back, to show them the new photo, to hand everything over and let them sort out whatever nightmare I had stepped into. But the rest of me, the part that had spent years finding comfort in small, quiet moments, hesitated. I didn't want them to take the camera. I didn't want them to tell me I was seeing things that weren't there. And most of all, I didn't want them to think this was connected to Claire in a way that made me responsible for something I didn't understand. I got up and paced the length of the kitchen. Every few steps I caught myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing outside. The sky was overcast, the clouds low enough that they seemed to press against the tops of the trees. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy rather than peaceful. I kept telling myself I was safe, but each time I turned around, I felt the faintest impression of being observed, like a whisper of presence lingering just beyond the doorway. The fragment of the torn photograph in my jacket pocket felt heavier now. I took it out and set it beside the new print. The textures were similar. The film stock aged in the same way. Whoever had taken the torn photo had likely stood on that same stretch of gravel. They might have captured something impossible too, a sight they couldn't bring themselves to keep. I wondered what their photograph had shown. A figure, a shadow, Claire, or someone else entirely. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, and every second seemed to emphasize how little sense any of this made. But one certainty kept rising through the fog of confusion. I wasn't done with that road. Not yet. The missing woman, the torn photograph, the shoe print. They were pieces of something larger than I had allowed myself to consider. And I couldn't shake the feeling that all of it was building toward a moment I hadn't reached yet, a moment that might already be waiting for me. By late afternoon, I found myself grabbing my keys again. I didn't want to go back. A sane person wouldn't have gone back. But curiosity and dread had begun to braid together inside me, pulling me toward the place where the world had started to come undone. If time was fraying at the edges out there, I needed to understand why. Or at least I needed to understand what it wanted from me. I drove without turning on the radio. The silence inside the car felt safer than any sound I could have filled it with. The road leading out of town stretched ahead like a long, pale thread, and I followed it with the same uneasy determination someone might have when returning to the scene of a dream they can't shake. The day had dimmed, the sky fading into a washed-out gray that made the surrounding trees look older somehow, as if they belonged to a time I had already passed through without noticing. I told myself I wasn't going back to look for anything specific. Not Claire, not whoever had left the torn photograph, not the owner of the shoe print. But the truth was harder to swallow. I was going back because a piece of me felt as if I'd already left something behind there, something I didn't remember losing, and I needed to see whether the road would offer it back. As I turned onto the long curve that led to the quiet stretch where everything had begun, a pulse of familiarity moved through me. Not memory, something deeper, a strange recognition in my chest, like stepping into a room where you know you've once stood, even if no moment of your life can explain it. The air grew colder as I rolled down the window, and the smell of damp leaves filled the car. This time I parked a little farther down the road, partly out of caution, partly out of instinct. I didn't want to retrace the exact same steps, not until I understood what the road wanted to reveal. When I stepped out of the car, the forest felt heavier than before, the kind of heaviness that comes from stillness that's too perfect. Even the birds seemed to have paused their routines, as though waiting for something to happen before they resumed their simple lives. I walked slowly, scanning the ground for more torn pieces of film. The gravel shifted beneath my feet, each crunch echoing more loudly than it should have. I checked the ditch, the grass, the base of trees. Nothing. But the absence didn't comfort me. It felt intentional, as if whatever had left the first fragment behind was finished with that part of the story. I reached the dip in the road where I had stood the first time, then the second. I didn't take out the camera yet. I just looked. The trees stood quietly, their branches forming crooked silhouettes against the dull sky. The fence post leaned exactly as before, but something about the light felt different, not brighter or darker, but slightly displaced, like the world had shifted half an inch to the left. I closed my eyes and listened. At first there was nothing, and then a faint hum, coming from somewhere deeper in the trees. It wasn't mechanical, not quite. More like the low, distant vibration of something old waking up, or something trying not to. I opened my eyes, scanning the forest for movement, but the sound didn't grow louder or change direction. It hovered, an almost static tone sitting on the air like a thin sheet of pressure. I stepped off the road and onto the soft earth, moving toward the source. The deeper I walked, the quieter the world became. Even my breathing felt muted. 20 or 30 feet in, the hum stopped so abruptly it made me freeze mid-step. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your heartbeat in a way that feels wrong. And that was when I saw it. A patch of ground, perfectly circular, where the leaves had been cleared away. Not by wind, not by animals. The edges were too clean, too smooth, as if the forest floor had been brushed by an invisible hand. At the center lay something that made a chill run all the way to my spine. A full photograph, untouched by weather, resting face down on the bare earth. I crouched slowly, afraid the slightest movement would disturb whatever moment I had just walked into. I hesitated before picking it up. Every instinct in me screamed not to touch it, but I was far beyond listening to instinct. When I finally lifted the photo and turned it over, my stomach dropped. It wasn't Claire, it wasn't me. It was the road, empty, quiet, still. But in the far distance of the frame, barely visible unless you looked long enough, stood a figure. Faint, featureless, facing the camera, waiting. I stepped back without meaning to, my boot sinking slightly into the softened earth. The photograph trembled in my hand, though I wasn't sure if it was the cold or something deeper tightening through me. The figure in the distance was no more than a silhouette, a thin, upright shape, washed in pale gray. No details, no face. Yet it carried an unmistakable sense of awareness, as if it wasn't just part of the scenery, but an active observer waiting for the moment I would finally notice it. I held the photo closer, trying to make sense of the faint outlines. The figure stood on the same road where I now stood, just much farther down, where the trees grew tighter and the asphalt curved out of sight. The angle of the shot matched my own perspective almost perfectly, and that was what chilled me most. Whoever had taken this photo had stood roughly where I was standing, feet placed in the same spot, lens pointed in the same direction, capturing a moment that felt eerily close to mine. But there was something else, a subtle distortion near the edges of the photo, like a ripple spreading from the figure outward, a blurring of trees, a slight warping of shadows. The kind of effect that doesn't come from a shaky hand or bad lighting. It looked like the image itself was bending around the figure, struggling to contain it. I lowered the photo and looked toward the distant curve in the real road. Nothing was there. No silhouette, no movement, just empty asphalt and trees standing the way trees always do. But an invisible weight pressed against the back of my thoughts, nudging me toward the curve as if encouraging me to follow something I knew I shouldn't. I slipped the photo into my jacket pocket, suddenly aware of how cold the air had become. The forest felt tense now, like a held breath. Even the ground seemed quieter beneath my steps as I walked back toward the road. When I reached it, I stood in the exact spot where the photographer must have stood and lifted my camera, aligning my viewfinder with the scene in the photograph. The distance matched perfectly. The dip in the road, the narrowing tree line, the subtle slope where the asphalt bent. I waited. 3 seconds, 5, 10, hoping something, anything, would shift. Nothing did. I lowered the camera again and tried to understand the growing unease curling inside me. The torn photograph, the shoe print, the missing woman, and now this new image. They weren't random pieces. They were forming something, a pattern that hadn't yet revealed its shape. And whatever that figure represented, whoever it was, felt like a part of the same thread pulling me deeper into a moment I had never consented to enter. As I stood there, the subtle hum returned, not from the forest this time, but from my pocket, the one carrying the photograph. I froze, the sound vibrating softly against my chest, more sensation than noise. I reached into my jacket and pulled the photo out carefully. The moment it was exposed to the air, the hum stopped again, completely. I frowned and held it toward the light filtering through the branches. At first nothing had changed, but then I saw it. The figure in the distance was slightly closer. Not by much, barely a shift of a few feet, but it was undeniable. The figure had moved, or the photograph had changed, or time inside the image had continued without me. Every explanation felt equally impossible. I turned the photo over, searching again for writing, for some clue left by the previous photographer. But the back was still blank, perfectly clean except for a faint scratch near the top, like the beginning of a letter that had been interrupted or abandoned. My pulse pounded in my ears as I looked back at the road itself, half expecting to see the distant shape stepping toward me. But the world out here obeyed the rules. Only the photograph refused to. I stood very still, suddenly aware that I had crossed an invisible line the moment I touched the picture. It wasn't just that I had found evidence of someone else being here. It was that whatever they encountered might still be happening. Caught in loops, echoes, distortions I didn't yet understand. And now I held a piece of it in my hand. Something was moving in that frozen moment, and it wasn't done. Not with the photograph, not with the road, and maybe not with me. I drove home with the photograph resting on the passenger seat, the corner of it lifting every now and then with the movement of the car, like it was trying to breathe. Every time my eyes drifted toward it, I felt that same cold knot in my chest tighten, as if the image wasn't just showing a moment, but watching me take it somewhere it didn't belong. I tried not to look directly at the figure in the distance, but its faint outline hovered in my thoughts, like an after-image burned into my memory. I kept reminding myself it was only a picture, yet nothing about it behaved the way a photo should. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the sky had dimmed into a muted blue, the kind that touched everything with a sense of early winter. I parked in front of the house and took a long breath before grabbing the photograph again. It felt colder than the outside air, a chill that seeped into my fingertips. I didn't turn it over to check the figure's position. I didn't want to know if it had moved again during the drive. Inside, the familiar warmth of the house didn't bring any comfort. The living room looked smaller, as if the shadows had inched a little closer while I was gone. I set the photograph on the table next to the earlier prints, the one of Claire, the one with the shoe print, and now this new one with the shifting figure. Seeing them together made the space feel like a shrine to something I didn't understand. I poured myself a glass of water and forced a few sips down, though my throat felt too tight. I needed to think clearly. Each photo told part of a story, but none told it fully. If Claire had appeared in my photo, and someone else's photo had captured a figure that was somehow moving between moments, then the road wasn't just a setting. It was the hinge between whatever was happening. I sat down and laid the newest photo flat, staring at the faint shape in the distance. Why had the figure moved? Why only when I wasn't looking? The thought struck me that maybe it wasn't following me, but following the camera, tethered not to my steps, but to the act of recording it. Maybe each photo wasn't capturing reality, but revealing layers of time that weren't supposed to overlap. I leaned back, trying to steady my breathing. The house felt too quiet again. That empty kind of quiet that doesn't feel like the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting to speak. Then I heard it. A soft click from the hallway. Not loud, not sharp. A mechanical click. Something settling. Something resetting. The kind of sound a camera makes when the shutter releases or when film advances by one frame. I sat perfectly still. The camera was on the other side of the house, resting where I'd left it earlier. I hadn't touched it since returning. No one else had access to my home. There was no reason for any sound like that to exist. Another click, slightly louder. I stood slowly, feeling the prickling sensation that someone, or something, was close by. The hallway was dim, lit only by the weak glow of the afternoon fading into evening. I took one cautious step, then another, each footfall landing like a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. When I reached the doorway to the room where I kept my camera equipment, I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. I reached for the light switch, hesitating for a moment before flicking it on. The room looked normal at first glance. The shelves lined with old lenses and film canisters, the small workbench where I cleaned my equipment, the camera sitting exactly where I'd left it. But then I noticed something else. The camera strap was lying on the floor, extended in a perfect straight line toward the doorway, as if someone had dragged it an inch or two, pulling it toward me. No breeze could have done that. No vibration from the road. No natural explanation. I stepped into the room, every instinct telling me to turn around, leave the house, drive until I ran out of gas. But instead, I crouched and lifted the strap, checking the camera body. My hands shook as I brought it closer. The frame counter had advanced by one. A photo had been taken, but I hadn't touched the shutter. I swallowed hard and stepped back, staring at the silent camera like it was a living thing. Whatever was happening on that road had followed me home. Not in person, not in footsteps, but in moments captured on film, slipping into my life like a shadow that refused to stay still. And whatever had taken that new photo, I hadn't seen it, but it had seen me. I didn't want to see what the camera had captured. Every part of me resisted, as if knowing the truth would pull me deeper into something I wasn't meant to understand. But the longer I stood there staring at the frame counter, the more I realized I couldn't run from it. Not anymore. Whatever force had taken that photo wasn't waiting for my permission. It was already inside my life, threading itself through the smallest, quietest moments. I carried the camera back to the kitchen, my hands trembling with each step. The room felt colder than before, as if the house itself sensed what I was about to do. I set the camera on the table beside the other photographs, creating a row of moments that had no business being together. Claire staring from the first print, the shoe print angled toward me, the distant figure inching closer. And now, a frame I hadn't taken but that existed anyway. The idea of developing the new image made my stomach twist. I wasn't sure if the film tray or my own heartbeat was shaking more as I prepared the chemicals. Every motion felt slow, deliberate, like I was performing a ritual instead of a routine. I loaded the film strip into the dark room tank, the familiar click sounding too loud in the quiet. When I started the development process, time seemed to thicken. Each second stretched, heavy with anticipation. I stared at the tank as if watching it would somehow change what waited inside. Finally, after what felt like far longer than the actual time on the clock, I was able to remove the film and hold it to the light. I almost dropped it. The frame was darker than the others, underexposed, as if the moment had resisted being captured. But even in the shadows, one thing was unmistakable. A figure stood at the threshold of my hallway. Not in detail, not clearly, but enough. A human outline. Shoulders, head, arms, facing the camera directly, facing me. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but every explanation collapsed before it even formed. No intruder could have gotten in. No one could have taken the picture without me hearing footsteps. And the figure, it didn't look solid. It was there, but not entirely, like a reflection without a mirror. I forced myself to continue with the process, though every instinct screamed at me to stop. Once the prints began to emerge in the tray, the image sharpened. Not enough to make out a face, but enough to see that the figure was leaning slightly forward, as if in the act of stepping toward the camera, toward me. I backed away from the developing tray, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. My breath grew shallow. The house no longer felt like a place I lived in. It felt like a space I had stumbled into by accident, where the walls weren't entirely loyal to the rules of time. I took the print to the kitchen table and set it beside the others. Seeing all of them lined up made a pattern impossible to ignore. The first photo had shown Claire. The second had shown a shoe print. The third had shown the distant figure. Now the fourth showed something crossing the line between the moment on the road and where I stood now. Whatever was happening wasn't confined to a place. It was confined to the camera, to the act of capturing moments. To me. I sat down slowly, feeling the chair creak beneath me. The house hummed with a low, eerie stillness. My eyes drifted back to the torn photograph I'd found on the ground earlier. Its edges were soft, its center warped slightly. Maybe the previous photographer had seen the same progression I was seeing now. Maybe they had torn their photo not out of fear of what it showed, but out of fear of what it might show next. The thought hit me hard. What would the next frame show if I kept going? Someone approaching, someone arriving, someone older, younger, or not entirely bound to a single timeline? Or would it show me from some moment that hadn't happened yet? A knock on the front door shattered the silence. One sharp, deliberate knock, then nothing. No second knock, no voice, just a single sound hanging in the air like a warning. I didn't move. The world outside the door waited with an unnatural stillness. And for the first time, I wondered if Claire had ever knocked on someone's door before she vanished, and if someone else, years ago, had heard that same hesitant, impossible knock, caught between moments they couldn't escape. I didn't answer the door. I couldn't. My body refused to move, frozen somewhere between fear and a strange anticipation I didn't want to understand. The single knock echoed in my head long after the sound itself faded. I waited for more, for footsteps on the porch, for a voice calling my name, for the faint creak of the doorframe shifting under weight. But nothing followed, just an aching quiet that felt like the house itself was listening. After a full minute, I finally stood and took a slow step toward the entryway. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs in a way that made it hard to tell whether I was taking shallow breaths or simply forgetting to breathe at all. The narrow hallway leading to the door looked longer than usual, the shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. When I reached the door, I didn't open it. I leaned closer and looked through the peephole, expecting, hoping, to see an empty porch. But the world beyond the glass looked blurred, like the light outside was bending around something just out of frame. I saw the railing of the porch, the street lamp across the road, the silhouette of my neighbor's mailbox. But no person, no movement. Yet the unease didn't fade. I backed away from the door and forced myself to return to the kitchen. The photographs were still lined up on the table, quiet and patient, as if waiting for me to acknowledge the connection between them. I sat down again, staring at the newest print, the shadowy figure leaning toward the camera in the hallway. My hallway. I leaned in closer, studying the edges of the image. The grain was heavier here, more chaotic than the others. Like the frame was struggling to keep itself together. The figure's outline wasn't stable. Parts of it looked sharper with each glance, while others softened into a haze. It was as if the photo hadn't fully settled, as if the moment it captured was still unfolding somewhere beyond the paper. I glanced up at the hallway again, half expecting to see the figure standing there, but the space remained empty, though I couldn't convince myself it felt that way. The knock, the figure, the shifting photographs. Something was reaching across time, or falling through it, or trying to be seen. I picked up the torn photo again, turning it over in my hands. Its fragility suddenly made sense. The previous photographer must have torn it apart to stop it. to destroy a moment that refused to stay still. Maybe they had heard a knock too. Maybe they had realized too late that the photograph wasn't a record, it was a door. The thought sent a shiver through me. If I walked away from all of this, if I burned the photos or smashed the camera, would any of it stop? Or had the connection already been made, threading itself into my timeline in a way that couldn't be undone? The room felt too still, too expectant. I forced myself to speak out loud, just to break the tension. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed quickly by the air. I felt ridiculous at first, talking to an empty room, questioning things I still couldn't fully accept. But the house responded in the faintest way, a soft groan in the floorboards behind me. I turned sharply, pulse spiking, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the old wood settling. Or so I told myself. The development tray still held traces of the chemicals, faint ripples on the surface like disturbed water. I stared at them for a long moment, drawn to a strange idea. What if another photo had appeared on the camera while I was sitting here? The thought was irrational, but so was everything else that had happened. I reached for the camera with a strange mix of dread and inevitability. The frame counter hadn't advanced. Not yet. But I wasn't relieved. I knew, deep down in the part of me that had begun to recognize the pattern, that something was building, something waiting for the right moment. And then I noticed it. The faintest smudge on the lens. Not dust, not a fingerprint, a streak, as if someone had brushed their hand across it. But I hadn't touched the lens today. No one had. I lifted the camera and angled it toward the light. The smear formed a shape, a single line, then another. Not random, not accidental. Together they formed the beginning of a number I recognized immediately. 15. The same number of years Claire had aged inside the second photo. The number that had followed her through time. And now it was marking something on mine. For a long moment I just stared at the number on the lens, the faint streaks forming the unmistakable shape of 1 and 5, as if someone, or something, had wiped the idea across the glass with deliberate intent. My mind tried to retreat from what I was seeing, tried to catalog it as smudge, residue, coincidence, but the lines were too clean, too purposeful. The camera had become a message board, and 15 was the message. I placed the camera down gently, afraid that sudden movement would somehow provoke whatever force had slipped into my home. The kitchen lights hummed above me, flickering once as though the electricity were catching its breath. I looked again at the photos spread across the table. Claire standing in the road, untouched by time, the shoe print turning toward me, the distant figure in the woods, the shadowed being in my hallway. 4 images, each one stranger than the last. 4 moments threaded together by something I didn't understand. And now, 15 had arrived, to mark me, to warn me, or to count down to something I couldn't begin to grasp. I reached for Claire's photo again, running my finger along the edge as if touching it would somehow clarify the chaos. She looked so calm in that picture, not peaceful. There was a heaviness to her posture that suggested she carried something with her long before she disappeared. But she didn't look afraid, and that unsettled me more than anything. If she had known what was coming, why hadn't she tried to run? Or had she already accepted the thing that was pulling her through time? I wondered what had happened to her after the second photo, the one that showed her aged 15 years and seconds. Had she stepped into someone else's life, someone else's home? Was she still out there, slipping through the seams of moments that didn't belong to her? The house creaked again, a soft sigh traveling through the beams above me. I tried to ignore it, but a new, unwelcome thought began to form, one that made my palms grow cold against the surface of the table. What if Claire had stood exactly where I was standing now? What if I wasn't the first person this thing had chosen? I pushed the thought away, but it clung to me like the scent of chemicals in the air. I needed answers, or the closest approximation of them I could find. So I reached for the torn photograph again. Its edges were frayed, and the image, just trees and shadows, wasn't special on its own. But someone had been desperate enough to destroy it. Someone had wanted to erase whatever the photo had begun to reveal. I held it closer to the kitchen light, examining the tear pattern. The rip wasn't smooth. It was jagged in a way that suggested trembling hands or hesitation. Whoever had torn it hadn't been in a calm state of mind. They'd panicked. Maybe they'd heard the same knock. Maybe they'd seen the same figure growing clearer in each frame. Maybe they'd seen something else entirely, something they couldn't bear to keep. As I turned the torn photograph over, something unexpected caught my attention. A tiny fleck of ink on the back, barely noticeable. But when I angled it differently, the fleck connected faintly with a second one, and then a third. Not random. Letters. Faint, faded, almost erased, but unmistakably letters. I brought it closer, squinting under the overhead light, and the message finally came into focus. Don't follow. My heart pounded so hard I had to steady myself against the table. The warning was chilling, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Someone had already followed the path I was on. Someone had seen where it led, and someone had tried, too late, to warn the next person before the road consumed them too. I stared at the torn photograph for a long time, the warning echoing through me like a voice I had never heard but somehow recognized. I knew I should stop. I knew I should put everything away, call the police, and let them handle whatever nightmare had invaded my life. But something more powerful than fear held me in place. The sense that if I walked away now, the unanswered questions would follow me for the rest of my life. And maybe worse, whatever was trapped in those photos would keep looking for me anyway. I felt the house shift subtly, as if time inside it had taken a breath. And then, from the far end of the hallway, I heard a single footstep. Not a creak, not the house settling. A footstep, measured, deliberate, too human, or not human enough. The footstep came from deep inside the hallway, far enough that I couldn't see anything, close enough that my body reacted before my mind did. A cold spike ran through me, and every instinct I had screamed to run. Yet I didn't move. I stood absolutely still, my breath shallow and tight, listening for the next sound. Nothing followed. No second step. No shift of weight. No whisper of fabric. Just silence, dense and unnatural, as if the house was holding its breath along with me. I forced myself to take a slow breath, shallow but steady enough to sharpen my surroundings. The hallway was dim, the shadows stretching longer than they should have, as if the light was being pulled away from that part of the house. My first thought was to grab the camera, not out of logic, but instinct. If whatever had taken those photographs was here now, the camera might catch what my eyes couldn't. I moved toward it slowly, each step cautious, the floorboards groaning under my weight in soft protests. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the camera body, grounding me, anchoring me to something familiar. I picked it up and held it close, unsure of whether it felt protective or dangerous in my hands. The number on the lens, 15, seemed sharper now, more defined. I wiped at it again, hoping it would smudge away into something meaningless, but it didn't. It remained, refusing to let me pretend it wasn't meant for me. Another sound broke the stillness, a faint rustle, like fabric brushing lightly against a wall. It came from the same direction as the footstep. This time I stepped toward the hallway, though every part of me begged not to. The shadows deepened the further I looked, forming a gradient of darkness that didn't feel entirely natural. "Hello?" My voice cracked halfway through the word, coming out far quieter than I intended. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Is someone there?" The silence answered. I raised the camera, my finger hovering near the shutter. I wasn't sure why I did it. Maybe part of me needed to know if the lens would capture something I couldn't see. Maybe I had already accepted, without admitting it, that the camera was now tied to whatever lingered inside my home. Or maybe I was just desperate to prove that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. I steadied my hand and took a single photograph. The shutter clicked, loud in the stillness, as if it had startled the air itself. I waited, expecting something to emerge in the hallway, something to shift in the shadows in reaction to the sound. But the darkness remained still. I swallowed hard and lowered the camera. The idea of developing the film right now made my stomach churn, but the alternative was letting the photograph fester, waiting for whatever was inside it to reveal itself later. I couldn't endure that kind of dread. I returned to the kitchen, the shadows seeming to follow me in slow, creeping stretches along the floor. I felt watched from behind, the pressure of unseen eyes on my back. When I reached the counter, my hands trembled as I prepared the development tray again. The familiar scent of chemicals filled the room, grounding me in something real, even as everything else felt like it was slipping out of place. When the image began to appear, my heart thudded in my chest. At first, it was only the hallway, dark, empty, unchanged. But as the shapes sharpened, something emerged. Not a person, not a figure, but a distortion. A warping of the air, as if time itself had buckled for a moment inside the frame. A ripple shaped like the beginning of a silhouette, shoulder, arm, maybe even the faint outline of a head. But the worst part wasn't the shape forming in the hallway. It was the edge of the frame. Along the far right side of the image, something new had appeared. Something I hadn't seen while standing there. A second shoe print, facing me. Closer than the last one. Too close. A chill crawled up my spine as I lifted the photo fully from the tray. The camera had captured something standing just out of my sight, close enough to leave a mark, but not close enough to show its face. For the first time since all of this began, I whispered a thought I had tried hard to ignore. Maybe it wasn't following me. Maybe I had stepped into its path. Holding the newest photograph, I felt something subtle shift inside me. Not panic this time, not shock, but a quiet, hollow realization. I was beginning to recognize the pattern. Every time I tried to move forward, the phenomenon stayed just out of reach. Every time I tried to retreat, it stepped closer. It wasn't hunting me. It wasn't chasing me. It was synchronizing, matching its pace to mine, like two moving clocks slowly aligning. And I didn't know what would happen once we were fully in sync. The newly captured shoe print sat near the bottom corner of the photo, crisp enough to see the faint ridges of its tread pattern. Not exactly like the first one, not identical. This one looked deeper, the impression firmer, as if the thing leaving it had grown more present, more weighty, more real. I traced the outline with my eyes, not daring to touch the damp paper. It pointed in the same direction, toward me, toward the camera, toward whatever moment the camera had stolen. I laid the photograph gently on the table, next to the others. The row had become a kind of timeline, one that didn't obey the laws I knew. Claire on the road, the shoe print, the distant figure, the figure inside my home, and now this, an imprint of time bending closer, choosing its next step. My chest tightened. I needed air. I stepped out the back door, the cold evening wind cutting sharply across my face. The backyard was dim, the sky turning a steel blue that blended with the silhouettes of the trees lining the property. The world outside felt normal for a brief moment. Quiet, crisp, unaffected by what was unraveling inside. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to collect myself. But something was off. A sound, faint but undeniable, drifted from the woods behind my house. Not footsteps this time. Not a voice. A steady rustling, like someone brushing their hand along the bark of a tree. I opened my eyes, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No branches shifted. No shadows detached themselves. But I felt it. The same sensation I'd felt in the hallway. That pressure of being observed from just outside the frame of my own life. I backed up toward the house and closed the door, locking it with a firm click. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls closing in around the photographs, as if the house wanted to contain the moment rather than let it escape into the night. I forced myself to sit again at the table, staring at the photos with a heavy dread. I didn't want to look at them anymore. I didn't want to see the next shape that would emerge, the next anomaly slipping into my timeline. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy them either. The part of me searching for meaning, any meaning, refused to let go. My eyes drifted to the torn photograph with the warning, "Don't follow." Maybe that was the person before me telling the truth. Maybe they had already reached the point I now stood at, the point where turning back was no longer possible. A sudden click echoed softly from the living room. I froze. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. It was the same mechanical click I had heard before, the same click a camera makes when it advances another frame. My stomach dropped. I stood slowly, as if any sudden movement would provoke something waiting in the shadows. I didn't have the camera with me. It lay on the kitchen table. The sound had come from another room, from somewhere deeper in the house. I stepped into the hallway again. The air felt denser now, each breath slightly harder to take. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, growing more opaque. Then, from the corner of my vision, I noticed something on the floor. A strip of film. Fresh. Perfectly unrolled. Sitting in the middle of the hallway like an offering. I crouched, but didn't touch it at first. The air around it felt colder, as if it radiated its own temperature. When I finally reached out, my fingers trembled. I lifted the strip gently to the light. 3 frames were exposed, 3 new moments, 3 answers, or warnings, waiting to be revealed. I swallowed hard, already knowing what I would do next. I carried the strip carefully back to the kitchen and prepared the chemicals once more, my hands moving almost mechanically. When the images appeared one by one, my throat tightened. The first frame, the road, empty, still, just like before. The second frame, Claire, not aged, not younger, just standing, as if she had never vanished at all. And the third frame, the one that made my knees weaken, showed something I still struggle to describe. It was a photograph of me, but not me in the kitchen, not me at the table. It was me standing on that road, 15 years older, looking straight into the camera, eyes filled with a fear I hadn't yet lived. I dropped the photograph before I even realized my fingers had let go. It slid off the edge of the table and landed face down on the floor with a soft whisper of paper against wood. My pulse pounded against my ribs so hard it felt like it might break through. I stared at the empty air in front of me, unable to move, waiting for some part of reality to correct itself or collapse entirely. 15 years older. The version of me in the photograph wasn't a stranger, and that was the part that unmade me. He looked exactly like I would look if I lived long enough to see that many years pass. Same posture, same shoulders, same small scar near the eyebrow from an accident I'd had as a teenager. But his expression, that was nothing I recognized. It wasn't fear in the normal sense. It was fear earned, fear carved into the face of someone who had lived through something that reshaped him. He wasn't looking at the camera the way a person looks at a lens. They were looking at me, across years, across something deeper, across a fracture in time I hadn't known was possible until today. My throat tightened as I slowly reached down and lifted the photo again. My hands shook, the paper trembling between my fingers. The version of me in the image stood on the familiar stretch of the Connecticut road, the same place where this had all begun. His hair was thinner, his eyes slightly sunken. He looked tired, exhausted even, but standing firm, as if bracing himself against something just outside the frame. Behind him, the trees looked warped, not blurry, not out of focus, warped, like the forest had been stretched around him, bending toward him in a way that defied every physical law. It looked like the world behind him was peeling open. I felt my breath catch. The older version of me wasn't simply standing there. He was holding something. The camera. My camera. The same one sitting on the table beside me. A wave of dizziness washed through me, and I had to sit down before my legs gave out. The room felt tilted, as if the floor had shifted a few degrees under my feet. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to shut out the confusion, the panic, the impossible truth settling over me like cold ash. If that photograph was real, if that moment existed somewhere in time, then the path ahead of me wasn't a mystery. It was a destination. And I was walking toward it whether I wanted to or not. A sudden pressure filled the room, not loud, not physical, but undeniable. The air thickened, almost humming around me. I lowered my hands and looked at the other photographs, their edges curling slightly in the dim kitchen light. Moments frozen on paper that shouldn't exist. Then I heard something new. Not a knock, not a click, not a footstep. A whisper, soft, breathless, almost too faint to hear. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the house, but the windows were closed. The heat wasn't running. Nothing should have made a sound like that. I held perfectly still, listening. The whisper came again, longer this time, like a single word stretched thin through time. It seemed to float in from the hallway, seeping into the kitchen, brushing the edges of my hearing. I couldn't make out the word, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone trying to speak through distance, through interference, through time. I stood slowly, heart racing, and stepped toward the hallway. The shadows were heavier now, blurry at the edges, as if they weren't entirely attached to the walls anymore. I swallowed hard and whispered back, "Hello?" The silence that followed stretched for several seconds, long enough for dread to pool inside my chest. Then the whisper came again, clearer this time, just barely recognizable. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even my name. It was a number. 15. The same number carved into the lens. The same number that had aged Claire. The same number marking my future face. I took one unsteady step forward, And from the end of the hallway, in the deep shadow where the light refused to reach, someone took a breath. Not an echo, not memory, not imagination. Breath. Human or almost human. My future was no longer waiting on a strip of film. It was standing in my house. The breath coming from the end of the hallway froze me in place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even aggressive. But it carried a weight I felt in my bones, a presence shaped like a person, inhaling the same air I breathed, standing just outside the reach of the dim kitchen light. My throat tightened as every instinct screamed to retreat, but fear held me rooted, suspended between the kitchen and the dark corridor like a photograph halfway through development. For a moment, there was nothing else. No whisper, no movement, just that single inhalation marking the boundary between what I understood and what I no longer could. I forced myself to step closer, 1 foot forward, then another. The wooden floor creaked beneath me, the sound thin and brittle, like the house itself feared what it might expose. As I approached the mouth of the hallway, the darkness seemed to thicken, not like a shadow, but like a slow-moving storm. My breath fogged slightly as I exhaled, though the house wasn't cold enough for that. I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice trembled so faintly, I wasn't sure the question survived the air it crossed. Something shifted in the shadows. Not a full movement, just an impression, the faint suggestion of someone straightening their posture. I reached toward the light switch on the wall, hand shaking so badly I grazed the plaster twice before finding it. I hesitated, afraid of what the light would reveal, afraid of what it wouldn't. And then I flicked it on. The bulb buzzed softly overhead. The hallway lit up. It was empty, but the air still felt occupied, as if something only half tethered to the moment had already stepped out of sight. I exhaled shakily and took another step forward. The shadows now retreated into familiar shapes, the old dresser against the wall, the framed map hanging crookedly, the narrow runner carpeting the floor. I told myself the breath I'd heard must have come from the house settling, but deep down I knew settling wood didn't whisper numbers in the dark. I followed the length of the hallway until I reached the far end. Every step felt heavier than the last. I looked into the bedroom on the left, then the storage room on the right. Empty, silent, completely ordinary. And that, somehow, terrified me more. Whatever had been here wasn't interested in leaving a trace. As I turned back toward the kitchen, something caught my attention. A small square of paper sitting on the hallway floor, right where the shadows had been thickest moments earlier. It hadn't been there before. I would have stepped on it. I crouched slowly and picked it up. Another photograph. Not torn, not faded, fresh. I felt my pulse climb as I turned it over. The image sent a shock through me, so sudden I nearly fell backward. It was the same moment I was living now. My hallway, from the exact angle where I had just stood. But the frame wasn't empty. A figure stood leaning against the wall, half-shadowed, head tilted slightly as if listening. The outline was faint and blurred at the edges, but unmistakably human. I looked again at the spot in the real hallway. Nothing. But the photograph. The figure was there, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible at first, was another shape, taller. Its form warped, like a smear of movement caught at the wrong instant. Not quite human. Not entirely something else either. And though its features were missing, I felt somehow that it was familiar. The same presence that had appeared in the earlier frames. The same shape creeping closer with each new image. The second figure hovered behind the first like a shadow belonging to someone else. My hands trembled as I lowered the photo, dread rippling through me in slow waves. Someone whispered again, this time from directly behind me. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs, but the hallway remained empty, quiet, still. The whisper had been so close I could feel the warmth of a voice that wasn't touching the air anymore. I backed away slowly until I reached the kitchen, where the row of earlier photographs waited like silent accusations. The newest one trembled in my hand. On the back of the photo, something was written, ink still drying, as if left only seconds ago. A single word, soon. Whatever version of me appeared in that final frame of the last strip, whatever force had marked the number 15, whatever presence was breathing in my hallway, it wasn't finished crossing over. I didn't want to turn the photo over again. The word soon felt heavy in my palm, as if the ink itself carried weight, as if the message wasn't written on the photograph but into it, threaded through the moment it captured. But some part of me needed to keep looking, needed to understand how close soon truly was. I set the photo down gently, trying to steady my breathing. The kitchen felt smaller than ever, shrinking around me with every new revelation. The walls weren't closing in, they were retreating, yielding to something else that was slowly occupying the space. Time in the room felt stretched thin, like the hour itself was slipping, bending, folding over on itself. I knew without question that something had shifted permanently. Before no longer felt accessible. After wasn't a promise, it was an inevitability. My eyes fell on the photograph of the older version of myself, the one standing on the road 15 years after this moment. His gaze felt heavier now, filled with a kind of warning I hadn't noticed earlier. It wasn't fear alone, it was recognition, a silent acknowledgement that we were nearing the same point in time, that he and I were approaching a moment too fixed to avoid. And then a thought hit me, sharp and sudden. What if he hadn't been looking at the camera? What if he'd been looking through it? At me. A faint ringing filled my ears, a sound like distant static. I didn't know if it was the house or my mind or something else entirely. The shadows in the corners of the room quivered, not visibly, but perceptibly, like a vibration too small to see and too significant to ignore. The whisper came again, stronger, closer. Soon. This time I felt it directly behind me. Not a voice in the hallway, not an echo caught between two moments, but a presence breathing against the back of my neck. I spun around so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floor. Nothing. Just the dim hallway stretching outward, quiet as a sealed photograph. But I felt it. Something had been standing there. A moment too early or too late for my eyes to catch. I backed toward the table, heart pounding. My hand brushed against the stack of developed photos and instinctively I spread them out again, searching for a pattern, a sequence, a clue. Claire's image was the one that kept drawing me in. The missing woman. The first anomaly. The moment that had started everything. She had looked so calm in the photo, and suddenly I understood why. She had seen this before. She had lived this before. Her presence wasn't accidental. She had been caught in someone else's photograph the same way I was caught now. Maybe in her timeline, she had found photos of herself, older or younger. Maybe she had heard whispers from rooms she wasn't standing in. Maybe she had felt the same breath on her neck. Maybe she had seen a version of herself from a moment she hadn't reached yet. My hand shook as I rearranged the photos again. Claire, the shoe print, the distant figure, the hallway distortion, the older me, the one with the two silhouettes in the hall, the one with this moment. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The angles. Each photograph, every last one, had been taken from roughly the same height, the same vantage point, the same perspective. My perspective. It was as if the timeline wasn't being documented. It was being prepared, lined up, for me. A chill crawled down my spine. I wasn't just witnessing these moments. I was walking toward them, one frame at a time. The whisper returned once more. This time it wasn't a single word. It wasn't even a whisper, not really. It was a soft exhale shaping itself into something that felt familiar. My name, Stephen. The sound brushed past my ear so gently that for a split second I thought it came from inside me, a memory resurfacing. But the voice was older than mine, rougher. My breath caught. It was my voice. 15 years older, just like in the photograph. I froze as a silhouette appeared at the far end of the hallway, not fully formed, not fully present, but more real than any shadow. Not a stranger, not a ghost, not a creature. Me. A future I had not yet lived, a moment that was almost ready to arrive, and I understood then what soon had meant. The final crossing was hours away, maybe minutes. He lifted a hand, my hand, and beckoned. I don't remember moving toward the hallway. I only remember the feeling of being pulled, gently, almost respectfully, by a force that felt less like a presence and more like a conclusion. The silhouette of my older self didn't advance. He simply waited, as if the moment belonged to me, not him. The closer I stepped, the more the air trembled around us, a subtle vibration that made the lights flicker and the shadows stir as if they were waking. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, those older, tired versions of mine, held everything I had tried to ignore. Fear, understanding, and something that felt painfully close to acceptance. I realized then that whatever had altered Claire, whatever had stepped into my home, whatever had spoken my name through the thin seams of time, it wasn't chasing us. It was calling us forward. A quiet surrender passed between us. As I stood only a few feet from him, the hallway darkened, not sharply, but softly, like dusk settling where it didn't belong. The photos on the table rustled behind me, lifting faintly, as if caught in a breeze from a place that had no wind. My older self lifted the camera, the same model, the same scuffed metal, and pointed it toward me with a calmness that shouldn't have been possible. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then the shutter clicked, not loudly, not violently, just a simple, gentle sound that echoed deeper than it should have, as if it had crossed more than a room, maybe years, maybe decades. When I blinked, he was gone. The hallway was empty again, the house quiet, time unchanged and yet not. On the table, among the scattered prints, a new photograph rested, still wet, the edges trembling. I haven't turned it over, not yet. Some part of me knows that when I do, I'll see another version of myself waiting on the road or in the woods or somewhere I haven't reached. And when that moment arrives, I'm no longer sure it will be a warning. It may simply be where I'm meant to stand.